The mad experiment of teleporting an entire populated world was successful. Truth be told, far more successful than I, or even the replicator network, had suspected. And the cosmic-scale silence that followed the planet's disappearance was merely the icing on the wonderful cake of the small miracle bestowed upon Sheridan. The amusing thing was that the shadows, despite their concentrated power, still demonstratively kept their distance from all my ships scattered around the former location of the Coriana 6. There, planet-killing Cloud, just like last time, encountered one of the probes hidden by the invisibility field, first attempted to absorb the captured object's energy, and then, in fright, spread out, meticulously flowing around the foreign object. However, the Vorlons, it seemed, also demonstratively pretended that I did not exist here. But none of this prevented me from observing what was happening, simultaneously analyzing the vast amounts of information currently stored within the replicator network. Coriana 6 itself, as well as all its inhabitants and all their technological advances, held absolutely no interest for the replicators, being, as Sheridan said, an underdeveloped world. However, the process of such mass teleportation itself was of interest, both because the Asgard, as the creators of the technology, and my replicators after them, as its successors, had never done such a thing, and because it allowed me to understand a little more about the principles and limitations of the teleportation device in particular, and the matter-energy information transformation itself in general. Then several simultaneous events occurred. The Shadow and Vorlon fleets, having recovered from the initial shock, began moving again, pincer wielding the League ships, dividing them between them in some way only they could comprehend. A highly perplexed signal came through the replicator network from the behemoth I'd left behind on Babylon 5. Gearinx reported that Lorien, whom I'd clearly seen aboard the White Star next to the captain, had appeared briefly in the station's embassy quarters, glared intently and attentively, nodded contentedly, and vanished. But through the cat telepath's implant, a clear and unambiguous image streamed into the network. Captain Sheridan and Ambassador Delenn, standing in the vast darkness before two completely different-looking figures, clearly telepathic projections of the combined minds of two ancient races, the Shadows and the Vorlons. Lorien, having embraced the captain and Delenn and broadcast their private conversation to the entire fleet, somehow reached the behemoth, allowing me to see what was happening too. Damn local god. And his damn divine conference call. Look, Behemoth's voice reached me through the network. But don't interfere. The captain must do this himself. Delenn and Sheridan looked around in confusion, though judging by the captain's expression, he'd been expecting and counting on something like this. Finally, with a direct cry from the man, figures in the darkness, previously clearly hidden from the couple's view, suddenly became visible. The perfect woman, encased in a massive crystal of unmelting ice, and Commander Ivanova, stepping out of the darkness toward Delenn with a grim expression. "We don't understand you. We only wanted the best for you. We wanted to help you," came from the crystal. Destroying entire worlds with their entire population? These races are a disease. You gave us the opportunity to rid ourselves of them, and for that we are grateful. But you resist. Do you think the alien is better than us? Do you think he understands more? His words are empty, while ours are the true understanding of things. Stranger, Lord Baal, the captain frowned. What does the Gua'uld have to do with this? We're not talking about him. We're talking about you. We don't like being used. And everything I've heard over the past few years has been one big lie. We didn't lie. Despite your resistance, despite the aggression we don't deserve, we've never lied. We have exactly the same goal as you. We want to destroy the darkness. So why the hell don't you attack them directly? Silence. An awkward question, isn't it? I've learned a lot from hearing about your planet killers and seeing the same ones in your enemy's possession. Both sides have the weapons to destroy Zahadum, or... The man paused. I don't know what your home world is called, putting an end to the conflict. But both sides are hesitant, preferring to attack innocent worlds. You don't understand. Oh, I understand it all. I began to understand it only after learning of your struggle. And I finally understood it after speaking with Lord Bale, who troubles you so much. Your kinsman, Ambassador Kosh, once said, "Understanding is a three-edged sword. Your side, our side, and the truth. But the truth is, we no longer need you. Neither you, with your thirst for order despite all rational arguments, nor your opponents with their penchant for chaos and strife. Even from here, even through the third hands of Lorien and Behemoth, I could literally feel the wave of indignation rising among the Vorlons at Sheridan's outburst. The willfulness of an obedient toy disgusted them more than anything else in the galaxy. It's surprising they haven't yet turned all their followers into literal brainwashed slaves, sincerely hoping to achieve this through simple education and persuasion. And the captain clearly sensed this, playing out a risky but very subtle intrigue, leading his chosen interlocutor to the only desired outcome. But neither the Shadows nor the Vorlons clearly expected the Universal Grandfather One to broadcast the conversation to representatives of all the younger races. And that's exactly what he did, laying his cards on the table and allowing his great-grandchildren to see the true face of the overzealous adults. And that face was, by and large, completely identical. A tug-of-war, contemptuous innuendo directed at opponents, and attempts to convince them of their own rightness, luring them to the other side of the Force. Meanwhile, Sheridan and Delenn continued, and to my surprise, I caught myself thinking that it was as if they were conducting a single, shared dialogue. So logical and complementary were their words and arguments. It would have been imperceptible had I followed the conversations individually, but in the form Lorien provided, a link uniting all sentient beings present in the system. You only want us to see one point of view, Delenn said, turning to follow the shadow representative pacing around her, who had taken the form of Lanier. You don't want to kill the messenger, but you seek to destroy only the message, so that we don't see a choice, don't know it exists, and do only as you wish, Sheridan echoed, now circling the female figure frozen within the crystal. But if you destroy the Vorlons, they'll never understand they were wrong. They'll never admit you were right. This isn't a struggle for development. It's a struggle between two ideologies, equally stupid and vicious. A choice without choice. It's as if you're trying to force us to decide which of you is right, to force us to choose one side over the other. Just you or your rivals, nothing more. But that's not education. That's not a choice. Sheridan grimaced contemptuously. You remind me of parents arguing in front of their children, arguing until they're hoarse over whose decision is right, pulling their children to one side or the other. Not for the children's sake, no. For your own sake. What if we abandon the idea of choosing who's right altogether? They finished in unison. What if we just turn around and walk away, leaving you to sort this out on your own, face to face? That last sentence unleashed a wave of all-consuming rage from both the Shadows and the Vorlons. Even through the Gironix implant, which somewhat depersonalized the information received by the network, I clearly saw the fueling among both primordial races. Lorien saw it too. The first frowned, and his figure suddenly appeared in the minds of Sheridan and Delenn, extending his hand and insistently demanding that they come with him. Which they did, to the angry chorus of primordial cries that reverberated throughout the crumbling conference call. And with the fury, the ships also began to move. The Vorlons dispersed along the outer edge of the junior fleet, and the planet-killing cloud of shadows expanded, encompassing the entire space within this area, avoiding only the still hovering Coriana 6 Superhat-Taki and the Emperor's Will. The demonstration of the instant blockade of Zahadum and the subsequent educational talk with Lorien had given them some sanity, but their charges clearly weren't entitled to such generosity. Now, Lorien relayed, the moment of truth. If you truly follow your own words, do as I have done. Do not interfere with this discovery. Remember our agreement. Now, through Behemoth, I could see the interior of the White Star's control room, with the captain and Delenn aboard. The first was obviously showing me what he'd seen himself. Perhaps it would have been far simpler to beam back aboard the ship, but I suspected my immediate presence, given how much I'd irritated the Shadows and the Vorlons, would have led to anything but a consensus in this endless and foolish dispute. However, I wasn't particularly planning on it. This was the very problem Sheridan and Delenn had to resolve themselves, lest they devalue the outcome. "Captain, can you hear us?" Ivanova's worried voice came from the wheelhouse speakers. "Susan?" The captain nodded reassuringly to Delenn, who had rushed to him immediately after returning to herself, and answered the commander. "Did you see that?" "The whole fleet saw it, Captain. I think." "Yes, Marcus confirms. I don't know how, but we heard and saw everything. It was Lorien. He connected our minds." "I thought so. But Captain, that cloud of shadows. It's barely registering on our scanners, but even from here, with my own eyes, I can see thousands of missiles hovering around us. And we can't move. Those weapons, it's like they're sucking energy from everywhere, even from our life support systems. Another 10 minutes and we'll just freeze to death." "John," Delenn turned to the man. "Perhaps we should call the originals." "Mr. Lanier." "Don't rush into battle, Captain." The first shook his head, listening to the surroundings. "They're not finished yet." In the White Star's control room, two translucent figures appeared out of thin air, representing a very ordinary Vorlon and a very ordinary Shadow. To Lorien, the primordials appeared as dimly glowing silhouettes, as if woven by thousands of thin beams emanating from somewhere outside the ship. Were the overseers giving him a last chance? Claiming authority? Both figures glanced around at everyone present, lingering longest on the first and the captain. And then the Vorlon's booming voice echoed through the control room. "We feel you. Show yourself." "What? About what?" John frowned in confusion, and the next moment, "So, where did Kosh go?" The resurrected gluttonous Vorlon vanished from my sight on the station, literally the day after that memorable conversation in the restaurant. And a little trolling of Mr. Garibaldi. Yes, yes. I assumed he'd flown away from Babylon, having completed his mission to warn Sheridan about Vorlon attacks on planets. But things turned out to be more interesting. From Lorien's momentary figure, a duller spark separated, woven into the familiar figure of a Vorlon in a spacesuit, staring at his fellow Vorlon with obvious displeasure in the narrowed eye of his helmet. "Kosh?" John blinked in surprise. "Captain." The Vorlon nodded his helmet in his direction. "What the hell is going on here?" I was also curious to hear the answer to this question. "The path has become distorted," Kosh said with displeasure, looking at his kinsman. "You have become distorted. You have forgotten. You don't understand. You've been around strangers for too long. You've become different. Just like you." "No. Enough," the captain cut in irritably, eliciting a surprised gasp from Kosh's vocabulator and a turn of the ghostly Vorlon's head. "Vorlons, you ask the same question over and over again. Why are you here? And you," he waved his hand at the silent shadow. "Your question is always, what do you want? But I've never heard you answer those questions yourself. Why are you here? What do you want?" The captain indignantly stepped forward toward the ghostly figures, pointing an accusing finger at them, eliciting a satisfied grunt from Lorien. And it seemed this rebuke caught the primordials off guard. At least, neither the shadow nor the Vorlon responded, merely shifting slightly in their positions. "You don't know, do you?" Delenn said quietly, standing next to John as the silence lengthened. "You've been fighting each other for so long, arguing over whose ideology is right and whose is wrong, that you've forgotten. You've lost your way and no longer know who you are or what you want. So how are you going to guide us? It doesn't matter which of you wins today. In 1,000 years, it will all start over again. You're stuck in the same vicious circle as us." Sheridan's voice laced with poorly disguised contempt. "And since you don't see it, don't understand it, we'll show you. We don't need you anymore. You're ancient, wise, and evolved. But all that's worthless. We've learned to live by our own wits. Yes, we'll make mistakes, but they'll be our own. And we'll have to live with them or try to correct them. But on our own, and not at someone else's behest." "You can't speak for everyone," the Vorlon ghost shook his head. "They won't follow you if you die." The shadow representative moved his upper limbs. Immediately after this phrase, the cloud of shadows began to move, and one of the missiles drifting in close proximity to the White Star darted toward the captain's ship and was stopped by the hull of the Drazi cruiser, which overcame the stopping effect of the shadow planet killer and obscured the target. The bright flash of the explosion caused the hull to shake, forcing Sheridan to shield his eyes. "Strakat," Lanier said quietly. "They've shielded us from the attack, and the other ships are closing in as well." "Captain," the Minbari looked up from the console. "They're surrounding the White Star, blocking the lines of fire." "You see," Delenn spoke quietly, but her voice was practically laced with rage. "Everyone has turned their backs on you, even knowing the cost. How are you going to wage your war when no one will fight by your side? We reject your right to pit us against each other, and we will not choose either of your paths." The captain stepped forward. "You could destroy us all here and now. You have the strength. And you can just as easily destroy those who come after us," Delenn nodded. "And those who come after them. Time after time. Species after species. But it will only end with you left alone in the galaxy. Abandoned, forgotten, utterly failed as mentors and educators. And perhaps The Minbari waved her hand toward the observation window, from which, even through all the ships obscuring the white star, even through the cloud of shadows, the enormous golden silhouette of the Emperor's will was easily visible. Someone will be found who will destroy you. Stranger. I didn't mention Lord Bale. The Minbari waved away the ghostly Vorlon. He has enough insight to know when to intervene and when not. But you don't really think the Goa'uld Empire is the only one in the vast universe, do you? It's hard to accept the truth, Kosh said. I was like that myself. I didn't understand or accept it. Until the universe showed me my error. You have the opportunity to travel this path faster. I've been among you for a long time, Lorien said, listening with interest to Kosh. I taught you, I nurtured you. But then I stepped aside, allowing you to develop and gain your own experience. Now it's your turn, though their races are young. The first gestured toward Sheridan and Delenn, much younger than you once were. They've already proven their right to make their own decisions. It's time to give way to them. It's over, because we decided it was over. The captain waved his hand angrily. Now take your ships and get the hell out of the galaxy, both of them. Rude, came from Kosh's vocabulator. But fair, he finished unexpectedly. A tense silence fell over the White Star's control room. Sheridan stared intently at the ghostly figures of the primordials, who shifted unsteadily, seemingly insecure, demonstrating a serious internal struggle. Their ships behaved similarly, ceasing all movement and drifting. In a way, it was even understandable. It's not easy to suddenly change habits shaped thousands of years ago, leaving behind the familiar sandbox. Venturing beyond the boundary, as the locals called the void between galaxies. Here, in a small swamp of the Milky Way, they were the largest and most terrifying of the toads. But out there, on the scale of the universe, one could encounter far more terrifying beasts, to whom even the shadows and Vorlons might seem like tourist breakfast. And they were clearly wary of being left there alone. I will come with you, Lorien nodded understandingly. I have been here for a very long time, perhaps even too long. It is time to move on. We will go beyond the reach together. We will be able to see those who have gone before us. And someday, if that day comes, he looked meaningfully at Sheridan. We will meet your descendants there, those who will come after. In the meantime, Captain, call the primordials. It is time for them to go too. I remember the agreement, the first interrupted my indignation. Vorlons aren't the only ones who can split their egos. A part of me will look after your creations. But I can't leave my charges alone either. Yes, Mr. Lanier? Still tense, Sheridan turned his head to the Minbari. Send a signal. The signal has been sent. The Vorlon ghosts and shadows vanished quietly, drawing no attention. And their ships, still drifting around, began to leave the system one by one. The shadows, as always, simply vanished into space, seeping into degenerate space, while the Vorlons first retreated from the League fleet, and then opened their escape vortices. All that remained were the fleet assembled by Delenn and the captain, and a dozen massive primordial ships that had emerged into normal space after receiving Lanier's message. Each of them considered it their duty to first circle the Emperor's will, irradiating the ship's hull with various wavelengths, clearly trying to scan and understand what it was hanging there. But this went no further than simple, polite interest. Either, not fully understanding the situation, they assumed this was the way it should be, or Lorien had quietly spoken to them telepathically, warning them against any particularly abrupt movements. Or, in the case of such ancient species, even the replicators couldn't detect some of their capabilities. However, I had no intention of attacking them, so there was, of course, a strong temptation to scan them back, but given the size of their ships, and the fact that they were soon leaving the galaxy following the shadows and the Vorlons, I simply didn't have time to do anything more than a cursory scan, which I still performed, out of politeness for politeness, yes. Even so, the replicator network's results were organic technology, similar to the Vorlons and shadows, but something told me, at a higher level of quality of implementation. And these, it seemed, weren't individual ships, but something like the Wraith hive ships from the Gateway universe. At the very least, the total hull volume of each would be disproportionately small compared to their internal energy density. Analysis, with an 86.551% probability, suggested that this was due to the presence of multiple energy signatures within, similar to Kosh and his kin. In other words, these were literally enormous dormitories for energy lifeforms. It's far from certain that they contained every single representative of the ancient races, but I could say with a fair degree of certainty that there were quite a few of them there. Well then, Lorien glanced at the arriving primordials and nodded with satisfaction. "It's time to say goodbye, Captain." "That simple?" John asked, still apparently not believing in such a simple outcome of the final battle. "I told you," the first smiled, "that it's not about winning. It's not about destroying the enemy. My protégés needed this battle no less, if not more, than all of you, the lesser races. The time has come for them to acknowledge that their work is done, even if not in the way they would have liked, and for you to take responsibility for your own destinies. I've waited thousands of years for someone like you, Captain, to find me. And now I'm just as reluctant to leave. But there are things that simply must be done. That's why I wanted to gather every primordial remaining in the galaxy. And I can only hope that you will do the same when your turn comes. Teach the other races that will come after you, and then go beyond the reach, allowing these new species to fulfill their destiny. If your races survive this difficult path, I will eagerly await the day when your peoples join us beyond the reach. We will wait." "I remember," Lorien relayed once again. "I'll keep an eye on them after you leave." And then the First's presence in Behemoth's mind vanished, leaving behind only a small packet of information containing, some very, very distant coordinates, and a set of parameters that would allow what? It seemed Lorien had left behind a contact number and the knowledge of where to reach him, should such a thing ever happen. And along with the data came the clear realization that waiting out there would be not only the descendants of Delenn, Sheridan, and the other younger races of this galaxy, but also myself. Should I ever achieve the desired level of existence, and still desire communication. An unexpected invitation. Interlude. "Is that all?" Sheridan said, puzzled, watching the glowing ball of energy fly away from the Coriana 6 system. "We won?" Lanier echoed, puzzled. "We won, John." Delenn nodded, hugging the man. "But we still have a lot of work ahead of us." "Work. Yes, work." The captain jumped up, turning to the Minbari. "Mr. Lanier, call Lord Baal's ship." "John?" Delenn frowned. "Planet." "I haven't forgotten, Captain." The Goa'uld ambassador's voice came over the speakers. "I'll now adjust the planet's orbit to minimize gravitational distortion in the system and return everything to its proper place. And he returned. The pyramids, still hovering around the missing sphere of the Coriana 6, shifted in space, taking up a new position relative to the system's star. Then, from each of them, a bright beam of light struck the center of the designated area. From the intersection of these beams, a glowing sphere began to expand, growing larger with each passing second, until it finally transformed into a planet. The ether was immediately flooded with hundreds of panicked signals emanating from the Coriana 6. No matter how underdeveloped the planet, they clearly couldn't have failed to notice the appearance of the League's monstrous fleet in the sky, and then their own disappearance. Though Sheridan wasn't entirely sure how the planet's inhabitants perceived what Baal had done. "I'll never get used to this," Sheridan exhaled. "Captain," Lanier called out to John, "do you wish to provide any clarification? Open a communication channel with the planet." "I'll do it, John." Delenn carefully placed her hand on the man's shoulder, moving away to Lanier's control panel. Yes, and he definitely needed some time to process everything that had happened. And then he'd have to remember how many other tasks were waiting in the wings somewhere out there, in other corners of the galaxy, from Babylon 5, awaiting news, to Earth and Mars, where the situation was becoming increasingly distant from the concept of normal with each passing day. And he'd have to fix them too, simply because there was no one else to do it. I wonder if Baal's invitation for tea to calm the nerves still stands. The return to Babylon 5 was surprisingly peaceful, though the captain secretly expected some final nastiness from the departed primordials. After all, he'd thoroughly infuriated both sides of the ancient conflict. And in the Shadow's place, he certainly wouldn't have resisted the petty but satisfying last word reserved for himself. However, they still had plenty of time for that. And so, after a brief meeting of the captains, the decision was made to send almost a third of the combined armada of ships to the station, returning the rest to their respective nations. For greater security and just in case. Lord Baal's ship, the Emperor's Will, returned with them, taking up its usual position in orbit around Epsilon 3, its golden bulk reflecting the rays of the local star. Its pyramids, however, vanished into hyperspace as quickly as they had appeared. John noted only the numerous bluish flashes accompanying the jump into hyperspace, accomplished by a principle unknown to him. However, after the utterly incredible appearance of the primordial ships, assembled by Ivanova and Lorien, he was hardly surprised by anything anymore. And sometimes he caught himself thinking that he wasn't even that interested in asking questions. At least that way he would sleep more peacefully. Yes. "Welcome back, Captain." Garibaldi greeted him at the dock. "Is everything all right, or should we expect a return visit?" "Your pessimism sometimes surprises me, Michael," Sheridan grinned. "But no, Yes, I suppose you could say we won. The Shadows and the Vorlons will leave the galaxy, leaving everything to us, the younger ones. Quite a responsibility, if you think about it, but..." He spread his hands. "This is what we fought for, right? Perhaps I shouldn't remind you of the remaining pile of problems just yet, right? Earth? Earth." The security guard nodded. "There was a message from Bester." Garibaldi grimaced. "It seems President Clark is planning some kind of particularly nasty plot of cosmic proportions." "Bester?" John frowned. "What does he have to do with it? He's broke up with the Corps?" "Yes, after that incident with his wife. He flew off to some remote colony and tries to avoid the central regions of the Earth Commonwealth unless absolutely necessary. But he still has connections. So he told me the Corps director summoned an acquaintance of his. Garibaldi sighed. Basically, to cut to the chase, they're planning to shut down Babylon 5 for good. And since nothing worked last time, they'll be more subtle this time. With the help of telepaths, obviously. And yet you reminded me of the problems. Sheridan sighed heavily. It's not me, it's life. Yes, I understand, Michael. But that can wait a day or two. The people are tired. We need to mourn the fallen, care for the wounded, and, yes, figure out how to live on without the Vorlons' constant surveillance. Come to my office the day after tomorrow. We'll figure out what to do about Clark and his plans for the station. Understood, Captain, Garibaldi nodded. And you? I need to rest. I think I spent some time on the way to the station, and I even got some sleep. But I still feel like I've been working a whole shift in the mines. Of course, Captain. Rest. Problems are problems, but you've still accomplished a great task and deserve a couple of days' rest. Sheridan smiled, nodded, and hands in his trouser pockets, trudged toward the elevators. He'd probably start with a couple of liters of tea and a heartfelt conversation with a hospitable ambassador. Lord Bale hadn't been forced to say anything when he'd invited them over, so he'd take advantage of such a generous offer. Yes. Come in, Captain Sheridan. I've been expecting your visit. The door to Bale's cabin opened literally a second later, as soon as John touched the call panel. Am I disturbing you? Not at all. The Goa'uld smiled warmly, gesturing for the man to come inside and sit at the tea table. Already set tea table. Am I? The captain raised an eyebrow, glancing at the tea set and the various vases and plates with sweets. That predictable? I merely assumed, Bale chuckled, that after recent events you might have questions, and perhaps you'd like some tea. I can predict that. Sheridan nodded in agreement. However, in this particular situation, who am I to refuse? Are you starting to try on the guise of an ancient and wise being? Since the Vorlons and the shadows. With all due respect, John looked sullenly at the Goa'uld, but after a second he smiled. Go to hell, Lord Bale. I understand. Well, in that case, enjoy your tea and desserts and ask away. I'll answer if I can. What was that? A miracle, Bale shrugged. You didn't even ask what I was talking about. Of all the recent events, the disappearance of an entire planet should clearly have aroused the greatest interest in you. Or am I wrong? You guessed it, but just a miracle? On Earth, Captain Sheridan. The ambassador poured tea into cups, moving one closer to the man. You have an old but truly brilliant saying. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Ah, Arthur Clarke, I think. I suppose so, Bale nodded. He was a wise man. With this miracle, it's exactly the same. You've already observed exactly the same phenomenon before, more than once. In the case of Coriana 6, it was only necessary to, scale up the effect. Not so difficult if you think about it. The ambassador shrugged again. Although it did require rather complex calculations and, by your standards, an absolutely monstrous expenditure of energy. I simply teleported the planet and its entire population, just as I've done with myself and other objects before, the Goa'uld said, taking a sip from his cup. The rest is a matter of the nuances and principles of this technology. Usually the transfer of matter from one point to another occurs almost instantly, but in the case of the planet, it was simply spread out over time. But where was the planet all this time? Sheridan was eager to know how anything could be done with such a massive object, but he suspected that any detailed answer Lord Bale might give would be extremely painful to his mind, already rebellious against recent events. So he asked another, no less interesting, but slightly safer question. As an ancient acquaintance of ours would say, frozen in time between the tick and the tock, Captain. The ambassador grinned as Sheridan's eyelid twitched. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. Seriously, when an object is teleported, matter is converted into energy, energy into information, and then back again for assembly in the new location. In the case of the Coriana 6, the process was suspended at the information stage. Sheridan sipped his tea absently, digesting what he'd just heard. The idea that an entire planet with 6 billion people, buildings, technology, and everything else could be represented as ones and zeros, literally preserved in the depths of some cyclopean computer, left a strange feeling in the back of his mind. He'd even considered himself being subtly mocked, and such a possibility could never be discounted, certainly not in Lord Bale's case. But he'd seen it all with his own eyes, and he'd heard Lanier confirm the void where the celestial body had been, so I can't say that I understood everything completely, but thank you. You're welcome, Captain, Bale nodded. And what next, Captain? I'll be honest, John sighed. For the entire time we've known each other, I've sometimes had the feeling that everything, well, almost everything that happens around us is somehow connected to you. And you literally summoned half of them, the captain added silently. He was tempted to say it out loud, but the satisfied and rather sly smile that appeared on Lord Ball's face as soon as he began to voice his guess made him reconsider. Otherwise, he'd be forgiven for thinking it was true, and that it was all part of a grand plan to seize global domination of the galaxy and… No, it would be better if he didn't voice his thoughts. Yes, it would definitely be easier on his psyche. I appreciate your faith in my power, the Goa'uld ambassador nodded, but you still exaggerate its magnitude. As for your question, Captain, as Lorien said, the galaxy is yours now. You, along with the other younger races, will decide what form it will take in the future. A difficult task, to say the least. But empires aren't built in a day. I can only advise you not to try to take on everything at once. Human life is short, and each person can only accomplish their own localized deeds. Leave at least something for your descendants. Well, I didn't really think of myself as the arbiter of the galaxy's fate, John chuckled, reaching for the pastry and staring thoughtfully ahead. Although, it seems I'll still go down in history under some equally idiotic nickname. Of course, Captain, of course. And what will you do next? You, well, had some kind of mission in this galaxy? It wasn't for nothing that you were sent as an ambassador. That's more complicated, Ball said, spreading his hands. When I coordinated my intervention in the Coriana 6 system, I was given clear instructions regarding further actions. And? Sheridan tensed. Captain Sheridan, the ambassador said, becoming more serious. As the official representative of the Goa'uld Empire, I am authorized to inform you, as the head of the International Diplomatic Station Babylon 5, which houses the representation of the largest group of states in the galaxy, that the decision regarding your galaxy's potential incorporation into the Empire has been reconsidered, at least for now. Perhaps the matter will be revisited later, once you have resolved your internal problems and achieved at least a tentative degree of unity, but I think I understand, the captain nodded, puzzled. So, you're being recalled? Yes, Bale nodded. I still have freedom of choice regarding the timing of the order, but yes. Sheridan felt a strange, contradictory mixture of relief and regret. Lord Bale's presence in the galaxy had brought enormous benefits to countless sentient beings, starting with the Narns themselves. It was terrifying to imagine what a bloody war the confrontation with the Centauri Republic would have turned into if Bale hadn't protected the planet's peaceful populations from direct aggression. But at the same time, right now, with the Vorlons and the Shadows gone, the Goa'uld were suddenly becoming the only truly powerful civilization, one that even the combined fleet of younger races assembled to defend Coriana 6 couldn't seriously counter. Naturally, John couldn't help but fear that Lord Bale's government might want to exploit this situation for its own ends. Earth would certainly do so. I'll gather the council, Sheridan nodded after a short pause. I suppose you'd like to make a statement? I'd be most grateful, Captain, Bale nodded. I could fly away right now, but it would look rather, he waved his hand in the air, unpresentable, don't you think? Watching the captain's expression shift was somewhat amusing. I'll probably miss such intelligent people wherever I go next. But who's to say I won't find someone to give me a full head of brains in the new place? That's exactly what I'm saying. In any case, after the departure of the ancient races, led by Lorien, remaining in the galaxy alone wasn't the best decision for me. Not in the sense that I might succumb to the temptation to take their place or anything like that. I wouldn't, but the locals. Even with all the pent-up resentment against the primordials, the centuries-old habit of living under surveillance won't just disappear. And all of them, one way or another, will look back at the elder in my person, waiting for advice, guidance, and help. It seems that I am beginning to understand the wizards from one stupid fairy tale written by an English housewife who hid from ordinary people not because of some kind of fear of the Inquisition or persecution, but out of a primitive unwillingness to forever sort out the stupid problems of the Papuans. And so I repeated my historic declaration about reconsidering the Goa'uld Empire's decision regarding this galaxy, turned around pompously, and left the council chamber, ignoring the dead silence of bewilderment and apprehension that hung there. In fact, anything of interest or significance to me in this galaxy had already happened. Now I either had to simply devour everyone present for the remaining crumbs of technology, as normal replicators would have done a couple of months after arriving in the galaxy, or move on. Of course, there were the Teletubbies and who knows what else, but yes. In any case, before leaving, I needed to take care of a couple more remaining matters. Close the gestalts, so to speak. And that's exactly what I was planning to do. You're leaving, after all, Rao Dorn stated sadly, seeing me approaching him in the corridor. As I was saying, I nodded, offering him a walk. But I think I've done for you everything a creator can do for his creations. That doesn't make the moment of your departure any less sad. The feeling had bowed his head. But I understand, and before I leave, I would like to ask you for a favor. Everything that is in my power, Lord. There's a young human telepath, Alice, I said, tracking the girl's position through Babylon's cameras and slowly heading toward one of the elevators leading to the station's park area. I remember her, Rao nodded. I'd be very pleased if you could keep an eye on her safety while I'm away. There's no need to be overprotective. I've already taken care of that. And she's become quite independent and made friends. But she's already interacted with other felines, the first of your kind, and it should be easy for you to find common ground. Rao nodded, his ear twitching with mild interest. The idea of placing Alice Belden on a planet full of cats wasn't exactly the best. I was entirely in agreement with Ivanova and Talia Winters, who had advised the girl against living among the Minbari or Narns. But she had indeed clearly become attached to Yui and Shia, who reciprocated their enjoyment of their interactions and time spent together in the lab complex. So asking was entirely appropriate. Lord Ball. Ah. The telepath looked up at me in surprise, looking up from the book she was reading on one of the benches. Meet Rao Dorn, commander of the Imperial Guard detachment that arrived on Babylon 5. Hi, hello. The girl nodded, looking with all her eyes at Dorn, who was slightly embarrassed by such attention. I think you should have already guessed that he belongs to the same species as the Yui and Shia you already knew, with whom you interacted while you were staying with me. Yes, the telepath smiled. He looks completely different, but Shia once told me that such differences are perfectly normal for their species. I think it's called sexual dimorphism. You know, when members of the same species but of different sexes look very different from each other. That's right, I nodded, smiling. Did something happen, Lord Bale? Well, since you came with Mr. Dorn. Just row, child. The cat grinned contentedly. It seemed Alice's open emotions pleased him, especially since Rao himself was telepathic, meaning he could sense their sincerity. But this child of his? Said the cat, whose conscious age was barely 6 months old. Rao? The girl nodded, then looked questioningly in my direction, waiting for an answer. Nothing happened, Alice. I shook my head. I just decided to introduce you and let you know that you'll be a welcome guest on their planet. The planet? The girl frowned, puzzled. It so happened that some of the felinids who arrived in this galaxy with Rao and the other guards you already saw at the station wanted to stay here. This isn't usually the case, but since the Emperor assigned them to me under his complete command, along with the ship, I said, smiling slyly and spreading my hands. I thought it permissible to grant this request. After all, even after I leave, will you still fly away? The telepath jumped up sadly. Yes, Alice. I am still a subordinate person, so to speak. But I thought... Alas, Alice. But let's return to the proposal of my furry friends. We'd be glad to have you here, Rao grinned. Of course, we'll need a little time to get settled in the new world, but it won't be long. Alice's face showed intense thought. She was clearly torn between her desire to see a whole planet of cats and the attachments that had arisen at the station during her time working with Brother Theo's monks. No one's forcing you to decide right now, or, having decided, to abandon all other options once and for all, I said, smiling warmly and placing my hand on the girl's shoulder. It's just that now you have one more option. I understand, Lord Bale. I'll think about it, Alice nodded, still with sadness in her voice. We will wait for your decision, Dorn nodded. Having said goodbye to the young telepath, we headed back to the elevators. Now all that remained was perhaps the most morally difficult and arduous task, gathering up all the goods we'd laboriously acquired in this galaxy, and deciding what we'd have to leave behind. Because taking everything was decidedly, well, not impossible, of course, but flying away on a planet the size of Jupiter would be strange. The easiest thing was with the replicator blocks scattered throughout the depths of Babylon 5's hull and systems. I could simply command them to zero out their embedded protocols and programs, turning the blocks suitable for forming lesser ones into simple, building blocks, assembled from steel and a certain amount of rare earth elements. Yes, they would lose their replicator ability to absorb energy and adapt to external influences, effectively ceasing to be replicators. But it would be even better this way. Even in another world, I would be embarrassed to imagine Sheridan or whoever came after him trying to shut down and dispose of a station whose hull they literally couldn't cut. Yeah, but there was still the laboratory planet in the part of the galaxy I'd declared my outpost, and the testing ground planet where I'd tested the MNT reactor. And some of the blocks would undoubtedly be taken with me. The design of my combat expedition planetoid was precisely designed to provide enough space in most of its volume to fill it with replicator blocks. It would have been foolish to venture into a completely unfamiliar place and be left without resources. But I simply couldn't physically take all the remaining blocks with me. Although, of course, I really wanted to. Therefore, the remaining minor ones, including the components of the assembled ships and equipment on the planets, were sent to the system with the laboratory, buried under a thin layer of natural soil remaining from the original planet, and mothballed. It was quite a task, rewriting the replicator code from within the network so as to maintain control over them while I was in close proximity, eliminating the threat of them going autonomous and resetting to factory defaults, and simultaneously adding priority-level command transmission to the felinids remaining in the galaxy. Their colony didn't need this for survival. They had all the necessary technological and resource reserves for many years of development. But something inside me wanted to leave behind some kind of insurance in case of unforeseen plot twists. And also remaining, sitting in my cabin on Babylon 5, my gaze caught on a small silver cube assembled from replicator blocks and containing an object that defied all laws of physics. A music player from 21st century Earth. Its casing composed of a material impervious to any known physical influence, even resisting teleportation or transport through the Stargate. I'd almost forgotten about its presence, but now, perhaps I should have forgotten the existence of such an one ring by throwing the cube into a black hole or the depths of a star, but the pride of the replicators demanded a nut to crack. And since such a thing hadn't happened in this world, I simply had to take it with me on the journey to figure it out later. New world, new technologies, new possibilities. Something like that, yes. And so, putting the cube with the player in my pocket, I finally rose to my feet and went to the comm terminal, calling Ivanova. Since Lord Ball is leaving the station, it was worth informing her that the cabin she occupied was vacated, while also restoring it to its original state. The golden wall panels might appeal to many, of course, but a Stargate on one of the walls, leading to the opposite end of the galaxy, well, I doubted it. Lord Ball, the woman nodded at me. Commander Ivanova, since I intend to leave your station in the near future, I believe I should inform you that I am vacating the ambassadorial cabin I occupy. Ah, the woman blinked in surprise, clearly having missed the latest news while busy with the station's backlog of work. Of course, Lord Ball. I'll dispatch personnel to load your IM. No need, Commander. I can handle it on my own. But, as you say, Lord Ball, Susan conceded, there's a bit of chaos around the station right now, but I think we can find a window for your departure. Let me know when you're ready. Certainly, Commander. Ivanova hung up and I glanced around the cabin with satisfaction. Korone, Yuki, you may proceed to the Emperor's will. I'll finish here and then join you. We need to take some cakes with us, came from the elder Neki, demonstrating her priorities. And tea, Yuki added. Lots of tea. Yuki burst out of the next room, practically running towards Zocalo, while Korone, already in the park section of the station, headed for her and her sister's favorite spot. It seemed someone was going to make a week's profit on desserts today. And yet, it wasn't the slightest bit difficult for them to synthesize any of their favorite sweets using an Asgardian beam, which, admittedly, they weren't exactly doing. But it seemed natural products were still unrivaled. After watching Yuki leave, I gave the appropriate command, and a bright white beam struck the cabin from the ceiling, engulfing everything in the cabin that contained the replicator blocks. The panels on the walls, some of the furniture, decorative ornaments. A stargate in the wall. Very soon, all that remained of the Goa'uld Ambassador Lord Baal's cabin was an empty room with metal walls, typical for this level of Babylon 5. It seems the embassy sector's service staff is about to change management again. The previous boss, I remember, asked for a transfer the moment he saw the corridor around my cabin, filled with all the furniture teleported out, including some that couldn't have been physically removed due to its size. Yeah. I could have left the same way, simply teleporting from my cabin straight onto the battleship, but I chose to take a leisurely stroll around the station, to show off my face to the locals, feigning a semblance of nostalgic sadness about leaving the place and all that jazz. Mr. Allen. I nodded briefly to the security guard standing at the customs checkpoint. Lord Baal. He nodded affably in response. I was informed that you were leaving the station? Alas, I said, throwing up my hands. The work of an ambassador rarely implies complete free will. I can understand. Well, in that case, I can only wish you a safe journey and say thank you for everything you've done over the past few years. I'm not saying I'm wrong if I say it's largely thanks to you that Babylon isn't still floating around the surrounding system. I think Captain Sheridan put a lot more effort into this, but thank you for the kind words. Garibaldi's deputy smiled, nodded in response to my words, and let me through to the exit to the landing pad, where 2 shuttles awaited me. After a short command, one of them vanished in a flash of a transfer beam. Now all that was left was to wait for the next bustling around the tasty treats, and then we could depart. Well, and now the main act of this performance, huh? The installation for moving between realities had been analyzed and tested many times, including that incident with the reality from the children's show Teletubbies, which had to be destroyed with an annihilation bomb to prevent the spread of… Oh, never mind. Basically, every conceivable theoretical simulation and practical experiment had been conducted, and now all that remained was to fire up my great machine at full power, let the analytical part, in the form of a telepath's brain in a jar, choose the finish point, and jump into the open transition portal. But for some reason, I was hesitating. The likelihood of encountering that strange world a second time in such a short period of time, by the standards of the universe. Corone approached me cautiously, placing a narrow hand on my shoulder. Is vanishingly small. You might as well open a passage to a reality made of eclairs. Thank you, Corone, I smiled, turning my head and noticing 2 worried faces looking at me with growing concern. I don't know why I'm hesitating. After all, I'll see where the passage is open, and I can simply wait for the conditions to change for a new outcome. NECA nodded solemnly, twitching her ears and giving the command to launch the installation. At the focal point in front of the great machine sphere, a brightly glowing green crack cut through the emptiness of the vacuum, unfolding into a quivering, jagged rupture in the fabric of space. Several hypothetical images appeared in the replicator network through the brain implant in the bank. Everything was exactly as it had been during the test runs. The orbit of an unknown planet, completely covered in forests and bearing no obvious signs of a highly developed civilization. 33.3333%. Drifting in the void of space. A ship resembling a strange and distorted insect, a combination of organic and technological parts. 33.3333%, and a distinctly familiar, recognizable space station. Another fictional world with giant space squids and a scheduled end of the world every few tens of thousands of years. The scenes shifted. This time the telepath's brain foresaw the opposite. Completely unrecognizable spaces, offering not the slightest clue as to where the universal randomness would cast me. The next scene. A ship vaguely familiar to my human self. Extremely ancient and now drifting in a pitch-black space without the slightest sign of landmarks. The replicators didn't recognize the hull's contours, but for some reason, I was firmly convinced they had a long-standing and strong connection. If not with the ship itself, then certainly with its creators. The probability of ending up here was a whopping 82.331%. The remaining 17.669% suggested Asgard? Or some other majestic golden city hanging above the plane of the ecliptic of the Milky Way and representing a drifting man-made island with many golden buildings and a golden palace towering above them, from the edge of which, right in front of my sight, a beam of sparkling rainbow shimmers struck, disappearing somewhere into the abyss of space. A shift. A luminous tree of cosmic proportions, as if its light served as a substitute for the sun in the sky of the planet lying at its roots. A seemingly endless staircase in the depths of a mountain up which a tired old man in a gray robe, carrying a typical wizard's staff, was climbing. Gandalf, is that you? A figure in plate armor, sitting before a dimly flickering fire that absorbed more light than it emitted. And change. Enough, the NECA sighed. Lord Bale, we can go on and on about these random possibilities. You're right, I nodded, responding with a similar sigh. The next option, unless there's something obviously dangerous or frightening, will be ours. The sisters nodded in unison, taking their places on either side of my throne-like chair, set on a raised platform in the center of the small chamber that served as the sphere's captain's bridge. The scene before the seer shifted again. 5 practically indistinguishable cosmic landscapes, a faint flash on the edge of perception in one, the glow of a nearby star in another, and complete uncertainty in the others. So, at least it's not Teletubbies, I breathed out, giving the sphere the command to start moving, and I'll deal with the rest somehow. The next second, several things happened at once. The great machine crossed the event horizon of the interdimensional transition, filling the replicator network with a vast amount of completely absurd data. The next jerked in surprise, staring intently ahead, and in my coat pocket, a silver cube suddenly jerked, containing an anomalously indestructible player with the teeth marks of a chthonic creature on its surface. It jerked and emitted a whole bunch of radiation, causing the open transition window to ripple and seem to crush the space within itself. For a split second, all perception of anything around me simply vanished, leaving only a silent fuck, fuck, fuck in my consciousness. And when the connection between the blocks and the replicator network was restored, I saw. Epilogue number 1. From behind the planet's enormous disk, illuminated by the rays of the local star, a huge, 8-kilometer-long space station emerged majestically. Babylon 5, the 5th in a series of space structures of the same name. On the observation deck, located at its upper end, just above the main docking airlock, stood an elderly man dressed in the uniform of the Earth Commonwealth Space Fleet. There were no fighter training flights or the arrival of any important ships today, so nothing prevented the enjoyment of the cosmic void. and the sparks of distant stars. Except a series of bright white flashes caused Commander Sinclair to blink in surprise and shift his gaze to the left corner of the observation window. There, barely visible against the backdrop of stars, hung the jump zone. A cluster of 4 cylinders over a kilometer long, forming a sort of gateway serving as the entry and exit point for hyperspace. The scene was, in fact, mundane. Babylon 5 served as an interethnic transit point and trading post at the intersection of space routes, so jump zone activations occurred here dozens of times a day. But now, something was different. Flashes of light, signaling the activation of the jump zone from the other side, from hyperspace, by some ship, moved along the guide cylinders as expected, meeting in the center of the zone they bounded. But the funnel to hyperspace did not open, and the shining star of energy at the center of the zone flared brightly for a moment, and then went out. "What the?" Commander Sinclair said, stepping closer to the window in surprise, raising the communicator to his mouth. "Lieutenant Ivanova?" "Yes, sir," a female voice said. "Did you see this?" "Yes, Commander." The transition zone activated from the other side. The standard vortex initialization signal went through. The energy was building up to open, and then it was all over, as if it had never happened. But how is this possible? After all? "I don't know, sir. The accumulated energy, the single release of which, incidentally, would have been enough to scatter Babylon 5 across the entire local system, simply vanished, dissipated into space without a trace. Some ship didn't make it through, didn't have enough power to get out. According to the sensors, the pulse would be enough to allow a Narn heavy cruiser to pass through. This is something else." "Damn it, sir, look!" Sinclair looked up at the transition zone again and saw another series of flashes of energy accumulation. But this time the star in the center glowed a little longer, and the light on the station flickered for a moment. "Ivanova? The pulse's power has increased by 20%. The source is still unclear. I'm going to the bridge." Jeffrey Sinclair practically ran from the observation deck, practically flying into the elevator. 3 minutes later, he was already entering the station's command center. As he walked, the lights flickered again. The floor beneath his feet trembled slightly, causing him to grip the elevator handrails tensely. An invisible wave struck his chest, as if something had distorted the very fabric of reality. "What's going on here, Lieutenant?" Sinclair shook his head and approached Ivanova, who was standing at one of the control panels. There was another pulse, 150% of nominal power. At the moment the funnel should have opened, the sensors detected a gravity fluctuation of 3%. "What is this?" "Commander, again," came the voice of one of the operators, peering intently at the sensor readings. A series of flashes, this time so bright it was painful to watch, once again passed through the cylinders of the transition zone. But this time, the final spark of energy did not fade, shining like a small sun. A siren blared throughout the station, warning everyone of danger, and the colossal structure shook from end to end. For a moment, Sinclair even felt, somewhere in the very back of his mind, that he had seen all this before. But where? How? When? "Sir, this is impossible." Lieutenant Ivanova stared at the monitor screen, which was displaying the space surveillance sensor's readings, with a look of obvious shock on her face. "But dozens of transition zones are forming around the station." What? The station commander looked at the sensor readings with equal astonishment. "The craters are tiny, 1.5 meters in diameter. Not even a fighter jet could get in there. And they appear and disappear all around Babylon 5. somewhere in the gray sector. The place was gloomy and dismal. Anyone who had found themselves there, human or alien, described it the same way. The deep end. It was a slum, part of the station that hadn't received the proper funding for its construction, and therefore looked like the filthy sewer of a major metropolis. Except, of course, it was dry. In one of the nooks, clearly designed to be a cabin, a shining streak appeared in the air with a soft crackling sound that made the very bones vibrate, opening into a rapidly rotating funnel. The air current scattered trash, leaflets, and rags across the cabin, and from the rift in space, silvery sand spilled onto the floor, forming an impressive pile. As soon as the last grain of sand fell, the funnel collapsed, and silence fell over the room. A careful observer, had they been nearby, would have noticed that the grains of sand, initially motionless, began to flow with a quiet rustle toward the center of the pile, crumbling again and again. It was as if something were trying to mold the sand into a figure, but couldn't hold the pieces together. After some time, the sand finally managed to coalesce, taking the form of a humanoid. More than that, a man, dressed in a strange black suit with a metallic glimmer. The creature looked around in surprise, shook its head as if trying to come to its senses, froze motionless for a few seconds, staring blankly into space, and then glanced around in confusion. "What?" came a surprised voice. The humanoid raised his hands to his eyes, as if seeing them for the first time. But a moment later, recognition, surprise, and disbelief appeared on his impassive face. And again, "What?" The stranger raised his eyebrows. Annoyed, as if in disbelief, the man crouched down, picking up a small piece of metal debris from the floor and clutching it in his hand. The fragment turned out to be a length of cooling pipe, clearly used as an improvised weapon by the room's previous occupant. The alien held the loot to his eyes and, feeling his lower right eyelid twitch, watched as the metal crumpled, flowed, changed shape, and disappeared completely behind his clenched fingers. When he opened his hand, a small metal plate lay in his palm. What the fuck? Epilogue number 2. The Federation ship Enterprise, somewhere in Borg space. Captain Jean-Luc Picard stared gloomily ahead. His encounter with the being who called himself Q had divided his life, as indeed the history of the Federation, into before and after. Before, there had been common sense, politics, cooperation, and attempts to hold together the expanding young, by galactic standards, state, which had united so much and so diverse heritage from disparate species on hundreds of planets. After, all that remained was an absurd one-man circus, the threat of galactic war, and chaos. And if only it had been limited to the complaints Q voiced at their first meeting. Captain Picard was perfectly aware of how human civilization might appear from the outside, especially in the eyes of beings who had lived for billions of years and possessed, frankly, a completely different logic and psychology. They had resolved that issue, he thought, quite successfully. But then, another whim of a twisted alien mind, and they had what they had now. "Captain, the Borg cube is catching up with us. Can we increase the speed?" "Already at maximum warp, sir. They're not far behind." Damn it! Picard angrily slammed his fist on the armrest of the captain's chair. The cube-shaped ship looming in the distance through the observation window grew noticeably larger, quickly catching up. Jean-Luc was never shy about admitting that something was beyond his capabilities, but right now, this was more than ever. He turned his head to Deanna Troi, the ship's psychologist and betazoid empath, sitting in the next chair, and the next moment, The next moment, a pale green beam stretched from the cube toward the Enterprise, and the Federation ship shuddered, as if it had collided with an invisible wall. "Captain, they've got us with a tractor beam. And, sir, we're slowing down." "LaForge," Picard pressed a few buttons on the chair's console. "Do whatever you want, but get away from the cube. We need to reset the beam." "It's not that simple, Captain. We're doing everything we can." One of the bridge monitors flashed with changing readouts. The chief engineer was frantically adjusting the ship's force field configurations, trying to find one that would block the Borg cube's grip. But it was all in vain. In the encounters since first contact, the collective had acquired information about the vast majority of Federation ships' field and weapon modes, virtually eliminating their chance of resistance. At the same time, the ships linked by the beam began to slow, finally coming to a halt opposite each other, having dropped out of warp and into normal space. For a brief moment, a precarious balance reigned. The Enterprise couldn't drop the tractor beam, but the frequent reconfiguration of the force field still saved the ship, preventing the Borg from deploying drones and capturing the vessel. "Captain," came from behind Picard. "Look!" A bright blue flash flashed in the viewing window, expanding into a strange round cloud, from which a moment later emerged a huge, metallic sphere, several times larger than the cube. Jean-Luc closed his eyes in resignation. Even against one Borg ship, the chances were vanishingly small. And against two at once, even more so. "And the sphere, too?" the first mate exhaled. "No," Diana frowned, clearly trying hard to sort out the sensations that had washed over her the moment the new character appeared before them. "These aren't the Borg, Captain. These are..." And the next moment, the most incredible event the crew of this ship had ever witnessed in their long and far from uneventful service occurred. A second tractor beam extended from the Borg cube toward the sphere, followed by a flash of teleportation, instantly transporting the collective's landing force to it. And at that very moment, the Enterprise's view screen lit up, seemingly on its own. The feed from the external cameras vanished, replaced by... What was this? A temple? A throne room? Picard exchanged surprised glances with his aides, but their faces reflected the same confusion, and the screen reflected a vast chamber, more like the interior of an ancient Egyptian pyramid, and an unfamiliar humanoid alien seated on a majestic, gold-plated throne. Another of Q's pranks? A greenish beam of teleportation flashed across the frame, and Lord Bale's ship, somewhere in Borg space. "We are the Borg. Your biological and technological advances will be incorporated into the collective. Your culture will be adapted to serve us. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." The creature that appeared out of thin air was clearly a cyborg. This was eloquently indicated by the numerous implants that replaced or supplemented even entire parts of the body. What curious machines! Bale cocked his head to one side with interest, examining the guest, to the replicator's surprise, having scanned his ship and his body, and was currently trying to do something with the device on his right hand. "We are Borg. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." The Borg drone stubbornly jabbed its instrument into the replicator's body, attempting to inject its nanorobots into the body, which the sensors recognized as a high-tech synthetic. "You're so persistent. Well, let's get acquainted, kid," Bale smiled fatherly, handing over several of his nanites to the drone and establishing a communication channel. "We are Borg. You will..." the drone faltered. Bale continued to study the drone with curiosity, analyzing the information the nanites had provided about its structure and technology. The Borg were surprisingly like the replicator's younger brothers. Their approach to development, their methods, all of it paradoxically resembled the behavior of their younger siblings, only, weaker and less developed. "We are the Borg. Will you be assimilated?" The drone's voice sounded a little uncertain. "Well, what's wrong?" The replicator smiled. "Go on. We are Borg. We will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." The drone's final words sounded almost plaintive, and its stance seemed somewhat dejected. No, it didn't visibly change its position, didn't even move. But through the link established with it, the replicator clearly sensed a sense of doom and relief. The Borg cube, which had been hovering nearby in space the entire time, blinked green timidly, deactivated its tractor beams, and drifted closer to Bale's ship. The Borg had finally achieved the technological perfection they had long sought and eluded. The Federation ship Enterprise, somewhere in Borg space. "What? That just happened?" Riker asked a little nervously, looking from the view screen which had been projecting the entire time what was apparently happening from the inside of the strange sphere to Picard and back. "I sense a completely alien mind unlike anything else, Captain," Diana said, wincing as if from a headache. "We are the Goa'uld. You will be trolled. Resistance is futile. Ahem." What was I saying? My apologies, gentlemen. The stranger on the screen walked past the Borg drone frozen in front of him, walking forward with a broad smile. He was simply beaming with pleasure. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lord Bale, and I represent the intergalactic Goa'uld Empire. I hope I haven't interrupted anything important." Epilogue number 3. Destiny. Alteran exploration ship. Somewhere in the depths of space, Eli Wallace walked through the corridors of Destiny, his lips pressed tightly together. The idea in his mind was literally burning the young scientist from the inside out. He'd checked and rechecked his calculations 3 times, but each time he'd gotten practically the same result. It was a gamble. It was practically a game of Russian roulette, only in reverse, with only one single chance of success in the drum, and all the other slots filled with ammo. Too many weak points, too much of a flight in a state of uncertainty, with neither he nor anyone else on the crew simply unable to influence what was happening. Too many chances of screwing it all up, and then 2 years, 11 months and 12 days, discounting possible calculation errors, risk turning into a modest 1,500 years. If they're lucky, the ship doesn't shut down all non-essential systems, automatically redirecting resources to the engine with the goal of just getting there. Dr. Rush, of course, claimed to have blocked all the dangerous automatic protocols in the computer. But even he couldn't get Destiny into crewed flight mode. They lacked something. Knowledge, actions, status, but in short, risk was an extremely unpleasant part of his plan. Only an even more unpleasant part was the fact that they essentially had no choice. The drones pursuing them across the galaxy had thoroughly covered all known planets with gates, and all known stars of suitable type along their route. So thoroughly, in fact, that, having risked breaking through the blockade once to resupply, they nearly lost their shields, expended a significant percentage of their energy reserves, and damaged their superluminal drive, which was now unable to deliver its full power. Under normal flight conditions, they simply wouldn't leave this galaxy. The Destiny would sooner or later be caught starving and destroyed. That's precisely why he'd spent almost 3 days on calculations, And now he was hurriedly moving to Colonel Young! Eli sped up, seeing the officer wearily entering his cabin. Got a minute? You'll laugh, Eli. The man sighed wearily without turning around, shrugging his shoulders vaguely. But I just had a brilliant idea. I decided to try to get some sleep. So, unless you suddenly have another brilliant idea on how to solve all our problems. You'll laugh, but she was born. Eli smiled, immediately becoming sad. But you won't like her. Surprise me. New day, new galaxy, the guy breathed out, feeling a little awkward. The phrase sounded far more original and cool in his head than it did out loud. However, it seemed like that was the norm for such cases, right? The colonel paused halfway through removing his jacket, turning his head in his direction in confusion. The officer's face was practically filled with a vivid, "What?" expression. But the man finally controlled his emotions, shook his head, and, sighing, turned fully toward him. It seemed Eli had managed to pique the mission commander's interest. A success, indeed. It seems like it would be nice to hear a little more detail. So, okay. We're now flying through one of the thousands of galaxies the ancients laid out for Destiny's route, right? And, apparently, it's turned out to be somewhat inhospitable, if I may say so. And what do you suggest? Let's skip it, Wallace shrugged. We'll travel at superluminal speed without stopping until we reach the edge. And then, just like that, without slowing down, we'll leap forward, through the void, to the next one, until we reach the nearest planet with a gate. Is it long? That's the part you won't like. Eli sighed heavily. We've only traveled a third of the way through the galaxy we're in, and the void before the next one will be even bigger than last time. But what's even worse, he spread his hands, is that because of the last skirmish, we're running low on power, and the superluminal drive is damaged, and we don't have time to repair it, which means our speed will be lower than it could be, which means... Anyway, Eli, 3 years, roughly. 3 years. 3 years, Eli. Yang threw up his hands. We have enough food and water for a month. Well, 2 if we cut back on rations. Where are we going to find supplies for your 3 years? Nowhere, Wallace shrugged flippantly. And that's the most brilliant part of my plan. We'll sleep the entire journey. The Destiny has several compartments with stasis chambers. While you're in them, you won't need food or water. In fact, these 3 years will fly by for you like... Eli tactfully forgot to mention. A familiar, grumpy voice came from the cabin entrance, and a second later its owner, Dr. Nicholas Rush, appeared. That such a flight would drain our supplies to the last drop. Destiny will need everything she has, literally. And if he miscalculated, I wasn't mistaken, Eli grumbled. If he was wrong, I wasn't mistaken. I've counted 3 times. There's enough energy for 3 years and 3 months of continuous flight if we shut down all but the critical systems. And the stasis modules, of course. Eli corrected himself. And the flight will last anywhere from 2 years and 11 months to 3 years and 1 month. There's even a reserve for unforeseen circumstances. If he's wrong, Rush repeated insistently, and we're even 0.1% short of energy, the rest of the flight will turn 3 years into 1,000. Actually, Eli said quietly, 1.5 to 2. What? Nicholas turned to him. I'm telling you, I've double-checked everything. Even the worst-case scenario. If we run out of energy on some section of the route, assuming it doesn't happen in the first week, it will take us 1.5 millennia to cross the void. Give or take 150 years. You were going to say that, weren't you? Colonel Young looked at Eli grimly. Of course, the guy sighed. But I'd rather not worry about my calculations. And what about? If Destiny runs out of power, the ship might start shutting down unnecessary systems, as it did once immediately after our arrival. And since we'll shut down everything except the shields, engine, computer, stasis pods, and life support in their compartment before the jump, he spread his hands, then the only thing left for it to shut down is us. I thought Rush solved the problem with Destiny's computer. I've decided, the scientist nodded at first, but after a few seconds of silence, he finally sighed, acknowledging Wallace's point. But Eli is right. Everything here was done in a hurry, in an emergency mode. I can't be completely sure that I've detected and blocked all the systems responsible for Destiny's automatic flight. The ship might still not consider us a crew. Which means we need to hurry, Wallace said insistently. Refueling will be extremely risky, and every hour of delay reduces our already meager energy reserves. Enough, Yang interrupted the scientist gloomily. Eli, how long will it take to test the stasis capsules and get them operational? I've already covered testing. How many? A day, plus a couple of hours for surprises. Rush, he turned to Nicholas. You have 24 hours to come up with something else. And to test the computer's automation algorithms. We need to wake up on the other side as a whole. If I wake up and see nothing but frozen corpses around me, I'll shoot you personally. I see, Nicholas sighed. Then, since we understand each other perfectly, I'd like to get at least 5 hours of sleep, before going to bed in the freezer for 3 years. Yang nodded suggestively toward the still-open cabin door. Eli and Nicholas could only nod back and step out into the corridor. The doors closed behind them with a soft hiss, cutting the weary commander off from the rest of the ship. With a slightly nervous sigh, Eli trotted back down the corridor toward the stasis bay. You know one of the capsules is faulty, right? Rush called out quietly. I know, Eli replied without turning around. After all, I ran a diagnostic before going to the colonel with my brilliant plan. Why didn't you tell me? We'll have to decide who. That's why I didn't tell you. Wallace pressed his lips together, turning to his interlocutor. I'll be overseeing the capsule launch. I'll put you all to sleep, and I'll stay behind. If just one person stays awake, there's enough power for basic life support. More than enough to try to repair the capsule and join you. A small loss of supplies until I fall asleep. It'll give me a reason to eat less and lose weight, finally. He grinned, showing he was joking. I'd rather stay. The crew isn't exactly thrilled with me anyway. Besides, with all due respect, Doctor, but it makes no fundamental difference which of us will survive. Either way, it's a pure lottery. Russian roulette, I'd even say. That's exactly why I have to stay. Everyone on the other side will need you, Eli. Nicholas sighed. I've mentioned it too rarely, but you have enormous potential. It would be a shame if you wasted it. What's the point of potential if you don't use it when it's needed? Doctor, Eli looked at his interlocutor seriously, shaking his head. This isn't some whim of mine. I learned about the capsule's malfunction 2 weeks ago. I've had plenty of time to check everything, weigh the pros and cons, and make a conscious decision. It's a conscious one. I understand all the risks perfectly well. I understand that I'll most likely fail to repair it, and in 3 years you'll be greeted by my smiling mummy, but I get it, Eli. You're far from the same gamer nerd I met on Earth a year ago. I tried, Wallace shrugged, smiling broadly. Well, you weren't standing still either. I almost don't want to strangle you. Well, okay. We have things to do. Rush waved his hand and headed down the corridor in the opposite direction. Eli, after standing there for a few more seconds, sighed with relief and finally headed to the stasis bay. No one would run the diagnostics without him. 3 days. It took them all 3 days to bring the brilliant plan to fruition. Rush had indeed found a previously overlooked service subroutine that, in the event of a serious power outage on the ship, could have caused most, if not all, of the stasis pods to shut down, simultaneously adjusting the Destiny's route so that it would fly without stopping, while Eli himself ran diagnostics of the compartments over and over again, simultaneously double-checking his calculations in case something critical had been missed, and making adjustments based on the inexorably depleting energy reserves. Then, when Colonel Young finally made his decision, announcing it to everyone else, there was an atmosphere of doomed resignation to fate, short but so necessary visits to Earth through the communication stones to meet with relatives. And now, Eli stood in the last stasis block, with the last capsule remaining in working order, and looked at the Colonel, who seemed somehow aged and haggard. Are you sure? We can still replay this, and you'll go into hibernation, and I've never been so confident, Colonel. Eli nodded with a smile, extending his hand for a handshake. To his surprise, the man simply stepped forward and pulled him into a tight, almost fatherly embrace, holding him close. You're a great guy, Eli. Keep working. Fix this pod, and then I'll meet you on the other side of the void. Yes, sir, Wallace saluted playfully. Well? Everett Young nodded, glancing around the capsule. I hope 3 years is enough for me to get enough sleep. Holy shit, that's going to be a long vacation. That's for sure. If you have nightmares, Eli chuckled, knock from inside. I'll wake you up, pour you a glass of hot cocoa, or do some other nonsense. Well, come on, the man waved his hand, climbing inside. Taking a final glance at the neighboring capsules and their occupants, Yang nodded, signaling his readiness. Eli pressed the activation key, watching the transparent lid close, and the Colonel, with one last movement, froze like a motionless statue, falling asleep for 3 long years. After checking that the settings were correct, and that the automatic system would wake everyone upon reaching the borders of the next galaxy and detecting a signal from the nearest gate, he breathed a sigh of relief and slowly and leisurely made his way to the engineering deck. There was no need to rush, but he still needed to shut down nearly 99% of the starship, leaving life support and power only where it was needed. And then? First, he would sit for a while in silence and solitude, admiring the blue waves that accompanied the ship's flight at superluminal speed. And then he would begin repairs. He had 3 years ahead of him. The main thing was not to eat all the supplies in the process. After waking up, people would certainly be hungry. A bit optimistic, though. This is complete bullshit. Eli leaned back wearily against the wall, scratching his itchy week-old stubble. I went through the entire capsule, replaced all the faulty components the automated diagnostics pointed out. Yeah, you guys better not go into the bathroom on the 3rd deck when you wake up. He grinned sarcastically, casting a quick glance at the Colonel and Dr. Rush, frozen in stasis, frowning again the next second. Why the hell isn't the system detecting her? His week-old stubble itched mercilessly, and a wash would have been nice, but he'd been alone on this vessel for almost a month now. Who was he supposed to be preening for? In that time, he'd managed not only to overhaul the capsule, truly replacing all the questionable components with analogs, plucked from other, completely non-critical systems, but also to find in one of the locked compartments a box of some completely tasteless but quite nutritious substance, most reminiscent of nut butter if you stripped it of its flavor, leaving only the consistency. Didn't Rush mention the compartment door was jammed shut? Oddly enough, everything was resolved by cutting the door lock from the central system and shorting 2 contacts. The door couldn't be closed anymore, but, oh yeah, and he started talking to himself, or to his ice cream friends. That way he could at least pretend to have someone to talk to. And the need to spend every day alone on a ship hurtling through the galaxy wasn't so hard on his brain. Sort of. But damn, what the hell was wrong with this capsule? Eli kicked the toolbox in frustration and began checking all the connections once again. Any piece of equipment could be fixed, even on an ancient spaceship. He just needed to figure out how. Too bad they didn't have any blue electrical tape. They say it can fix anything. Here comes the void. Eli sighed heavily, looking away from the image on the screen, transmitted from a camera on one of the Kinos. The Destiny had reached the edge of the galaxy in 2 months and 8 days. Now ahead lay only the endless blackness they needed to cross. Even with the illumination of faster-than-light travel, the void between galaxies seemed bottomless. So dark and empty was it. Conserving his already very limited resources, Eli had long ago moved to the corridor with the stasis compartments, deactivating all other passages and shutting down the life support system, so that he could now only look outside in a spacesuit. He had just taken one of them from the shuttle before deactivating the ship. But wasting oxygen reserves just to enjoy the views? Unjustified. But it's excellent motivation for work, Wallace finished out loud, his voice hoarse from the long silence. He calculated that if the capsule's repairs weren't successful in 2 more weeks, it would be easier for him to simply exit through the airlock. Spending any more of his remaining resources would be simply wasteful. And this made him especially uneasy. A week ago, for the first time, he'd caught himself thinking that he'd made a serious mistake by volunteering. But it was too late to change anything. Even if he woke up Rush and took his place, the scientist wouldn't be able to do anything he hadn't already done. Okay, Eli sighed. I have one more idea. But if even this doesn't work, I don't know anymore. Rising to his feet, he set aside the Kino control tablet and walked wearily toward the open interior of the capsule, skirting the tools scattered across the floor in his sleeping area. The diagnostics still showed the chamber was malfunctioning, only supplying it with standby power. But what if? What if it could somehow be rebooted? That worked with the computers. The only problem was, only the entire block of 4 stasis capsules could be rebooted, 3 of which were occupied by people. And while he felt almost no pity for Rush, the other 2. Bending over to reach the tester on the floor, he carefully climbed into the open service hatch. Perhaps he could separate the capsule from the unit and connect it directly to the diagnostician as a separate device, and then... He didn't have time to figure out what then would be. The ship shook violently, and the next moment the space around Eli trembled and shifted, signaling Destiny's transition to sublight engines. But that was impossible. He and Dr. Rush had been checking the route together. Just hope it's not an engine malfunction. Just hope it's not a malfunction. Eli blinked in surprise, looking at the data from the ship's central computer displayed on the tablet. What the hell kind of anomaly? The ship's scanners detected a spatial distortion directly ahead. bringing Destiny out of superluminal jump and almost completely slowing it down. At least, that's what the computer reported. He wouldn't have been able to see anything else from his workshop anyway. And there was nothing to see in the blackness and emptiness surrounding the ship. Eli ran his fingers over the keys, brought up the image from Destiny's external cameras, and began switching between camera angles. By the third, he froze in surprise, nearly dropping his tablet. Directly ahead of the Destiny, in the midst of the intergalactic blackness, hung a spherical object. A huge spherical object. They had already flown far enough away that the light of the galaxy they'd left behind couldn't reach the ship. And ahead it was even darker. But the ancient ship's scanners confidently illuminated the image on the display, simultaneously transmitting parameters in scrolling columns of symbols. If you could call it that. The only thing the ship could clearly determine was the sphere's dimensions. Some 300 kilometers in diameter. The rest of the data was simply a collection of noise. Not the material. Not the presence or absence of energy in the sphere. Nothing. "It's a whole artificial planet, damn it," Eli whispered, involuntarily comparing the sizes and realizing that against the backdrop of the sphere ahead, the modest 700 meters of Destiny's length looked completely unpresentable. The camera's image began to flicker with static. A thin white beam shot toward the ship. And somewhere behind Eli, a long, grinding sound was heard, causing him to jerk in fear and start looking around. "I apologize for the unexpected visit, but I seem to be a little lost," a pleasant, polite voice said. "Could you tell me where we are?" Eli whirled around, only to see a tall man, a human, standing in the corner between two capsules and smiling amiably at him, as if this were perfectly normal. The next second he felt a sharp pain somewhere in his chest, and the world around him went dark. It had been a long time since he'd felt so good. Eli felt like he was lying on something hard, yet he was as comfortable as he'd ever been in his life. It felt like every cell in his body was filled with warmth, washing away the fatigue accumulated over the past months, giving him a feeling of calm and health. What was this? Heaven? He was dead? What nonsense! Wallace's brain, raised in a strictly rational environment, seemed horrified by the mere idea, immediately rejecting it as unrealistic. Certainly not after a year-long journey across 2.5 galaxies on an ancient ship sent by an ancient civilization thousands of years ago. I'll point out that this act was absolutely childish, even by your standards. A melodic, clearly feminine voice coming from somewhere to the right made Eli involuntarily flinch and listen. "You've said that 3 times already, Corone." The second voice, a man's, sighed, the same one he'd heard in the stasis capsule compartment. "And I'll say it again. By the way, your guest has already regained consciousness. The sarcophagus has alleviated the effects of the heart attack and the general exhaustion of the body. Try not to be so sudden this time." "What?" Elijah, realizing there was no point in pretending, opened his eyes. "What's going on?" He was lying in something like an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus? At least that was the first association that came to mind as he surveyed his surroundings. That would have been, of course, assuming the ancient Egyptians could fly through space and were discovered right now at a monstrous distance from Earth. The sarcophagus was installed in a vast hall, the walls and ceiling adorned with gold panels, bas-reliefs, and hieroglyphs, all of which further evoked thoughts of Egypt, but, at the same time, certain small details evoked a dissonance and a sense of incongruity, as if, "Please forgive me," the man said, "but my sudden and thoughtless appearance in your ship's compartment was the cause of your condition, which necessitated the need to take emergency measures to treat you." "Treatment?" Eli repeated automatically, staring in fascination at the speaker's companion, whose head was adorned with cat ears. "You're perfectly fine now. Allow me to introduce myself again. My name is Lord Bale, and, as I was saying, I seem to have lost my way a little, and finding my bearings here," he gestured somewhere behind Elijah, "is quite problematic." Wallace sat up carefully, turning in the direction indicated, and was surprised to find a huge panoramic window there, behind which, barely distinguishable against the background of blackness, the Destiny was visible, still drifting next to the sphere in which he seemed to now be located. "Damn! The ship's about to—" Eli jerked, trying to get out of the sarcophagus, but was stopped by Bale's calm gesture, shaking his head. "Don't worry. As far as I can judge from the scanner readings, your starship is currently attempting to scan my sphere, and I believe it will not resume flight until it finishes or declares its attempts unsuccessful. My name is Eli Wallace, and yes, I think Destiny, that's the name of the ship, will actually take some time to scan. But don't worry about your friends either. The stasis capsules are quite ancient, but they're working reliably now. We'll have plenty of time to chat. Would you like some tea?" Corone and her sister made eclairs again. I have to admit, there's something about their sweet tooth. Feeling a strange tickle deep in his skull, Eli nodded slowly, carefully climbing out of the sarcophagus. The surreal nature of everything happening made him feel as if he were dreaming. Or maybe it was all a hallucination. A brain dying of hunger or oxygen deprivation. And he was now slowly dying in the Destiny's stasis chamber, savoring his last moments, but the aroma of freshly brewed bergamot tea wafting into his nostrils, accompanied by the sweetness of eclairs, left Eli no choice. Epilogue number 4. Somewhere in Segmentum Obscurus. By the standards of the Imperium, the Giving Hand was a relatively new ship. Only 10 centuries had passed since its launch. And for humanity's vast military and industrial machine, that was far from a period of time. But Arcanim Cornix, a rogue trader and, in fact, the captain of this very ship, thought otherwise. Especially in the last 2 months. Irritably kicking an innocent carved table, said to have once belonged to his distant ancestor from Terra itself, who hadn't even considered obtaining a patent back then. The man straightened his jacket and took a deep breath, trying to calm his already frayed nerves. 2 months. 2 months they'd been stuck in this God-Emperor-forsaken system, trying to fix the warp drive and finally get it to carry the ship closer to habitable worlds. And if only that were the only problem. 2 months of stranded in a quiet, deserted star system, listed on all the maps as uninhabited but exploitable. Yes, he'd put that mark on the maps himself, relaying the information to the Gothic sector capital, which administered the system. Wasn't the worst thing that could happen to an Imperial vessel in that part of the galaxy. But it still made him nervous. At least, it did. If only he knew why the system had been uncharted in the first place, even though it was so close to a major trade route. But neither he nor the Adeptus Administratum official he'd tried to clarify the matter with knew the answer. The system existed, but it wasn't listed on any maps, not even the archival ones. Perhaps some additional information existed elsewhere, but he wished he knew where, and who would have given it to him. So, in 2 months of downtime, the new system was mapped, its planets and other celestial bodies scanned, and all this wealth was sent where it belonged. And then they got stuck. "Dinner is served, my lord." Alfredo, a hereditary servant of House Cornix, whose ancestors had served his ancestors for centuries, entered his chambers with a bow. "As you ordered, the invited senior officers have already assembled." "Thank you, Alfredo. I'll be there soon." Arcanum watched the servant bow again and rubbed his eyelid, which had twitched again. Perhaps he should stop by the medical bay after dinner, or just have an extra glass of Amasec? Yes, definitely both. First the Medicus, then the Amasec. He still had a couple of bottles of that elite stuff, bought on the spur of the moment at auction. And washing down a sedative with Amasec, that's just the basics. Nodding contentedly to himself, the man put on an appropriate expression and headed toward the banquet hall set up not far from his chambers. "Gentlemen, I am glad to see you," he nodded briefly, entering the tall carved doors that the servitors had helpfully opened for him. "My Lord Cornix," came a discordant voice as those present rose from their seats at the table, bowing respectfully. To the captain's slight surprise, even the Magos biologist showed up, though the Adeptus Mechanicus representative rarely left his quarters on the medical deck, occupied with research and experiments. Arcanum didn't even try to understand. He was satisfied that the Mechanicus, like his subordinates, were excellent medics and provided highly qualified medical care when needed. The tech priest Majoris, as was entirely expected, was absent, maintaining the ship's systems and, as he put it, appeasing the spirit of the warp drive machine occupied all his time. For the last 2 months, yes. "Let's get started. I see the chef has really gone all out today." With a smile, Arcanum took his place at the head of the table and, carefully straightening the snow-white napkin on his lap, nodded to one of the servants standing nearby that the dishes could be served. He had introduced these dinners almost a year ago. They were a good way not only to while away the time in, frankly, not the most unpleasant company, but also to conduct a sort of work meeting in a relaxed atmosphere. Sometimes, as experience showed, he was able to learn about many looming problems much faster from table conversations than from the officers' official reports. "I'm detecting hyperkinesis in your left lower eyelid, my Lord Cornix." A metallic voice rang out as soon as the captain came into the Magus' field of vision. "Recommendation: report to Unit 43.19/1 on the medical deck for examination." "Thank you, Magus," Arcanum nodded. "That's what I was planning to do after lunch. The hyperkinetic, nervous tic doesn't bother me much, though it does occur with surprising regularity." "By the way, you're not the only one, my lord," the first mate said. "Just today, one of the midshipmen complained to me. 2 incidents. That's a coincidence, of course, but I recommend conducting a crew survey," the Magos croaked. "No anomalies in the system capable of affecting biological organisms have been detected, but the probability of error is 2.48%. "I'll send Marcus to you, Magus," the first mate nodded, "and I'll check the other officers, in case anyone else has the same problem." An epidemic of nervous tics. It was just laughable. Arcanum shook his head, half listening to the officers' conversations while enjoying the dish before him. The unspoken rule of such feasts was almost complete freedom of speech. Of course, everyone here was already a senior officer. But still, there was a chain of command, and so, omitting questions of direct orders if necessary, Everyone spoke practically freely. Politely, but freely. Cornix gestured for a servant to pour him some amasec, then raised his glass and began to swirl it in his hand, gazing thoughtfully ahead. By all appearances, everything on the ship was in order. At least, no worse than yesterday or a week ago. Even the lower-level crew, always considered the least trustworthy part of the crew, were quiet, simply doing their jobs. Perhaps he'd just been lucky with this crew, though. Who knows? But the captain's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp trill of a call in his ear. And the next second, a wave of alarms swept through the ship, causing everyone present to jump from their seats. "What's the matter?" He touched the vox bead, accepting the call. "My Lord Cornix, the ship's auspex has just detected a massive anomaly on the starboard side. About, 300 kilometers across." 300 kilometers? "Details," he ordered briefly, throwing a napkin on the table and gesturing for those present to go to their posts. "There's a strong fluctuation in the electromagnetic fields, the materium." The speaker hesitated. "The materium is distorted, as if something is coming out of the warp, but our navigator claims there's nothing there." "This is just what we need. I'm going to the bridge." Cornix practically ran through the corridors of the Giving Hand. Not exactly the most befitting behavior for a rogue trader, but right now he didn't care. The phrase, "something coming out of the warp," was hardly the most welcome sound for any inhabitant of the Imperium, especially in the Obscurus sector, when you're stuck on a single ship in an empty system, your warp drive balking, refusing to carry you to more civilized places. What could it be? The exit point of a large fleet of unknown origin? Another attack by the servants of the ruinous powers? A natural anomaly the likes of which no one had ever seen before? A Xenos prank? Flashworts, Arcanym shuddered, imagining every possibility. The choice was so vast that he had trouble deciding which one he liked least. And judging by the bustle on the bridge, he wasn't alone in having similar thoughts. He hadn't even reached the captain's chair, the massive throne perched on a raised platform in the center of the deckhouse where all the ship's controls and vital data were concentrated, when the battlecruiser shuddered from stem to stern. Or rather, it wasn't so much a shudder as a sort of floating. Cornix even thought he saw a barely perceptible wave of distortion roll through the bridge's columns and cogitators. "My Lord Cornix," the officer on duty, who had been communicating with him via Vox, ran up to him in alarm. "The auspex readings are nonsense. Such readings simply can't be real, but we've been caught in a gravitational distortion." The ship shuddered again, sending a nasty tugging sensation through everyone's bones. And the next moment, before Arcanum could speak, the starboard windows flared brightly as a blindingly bright star lit up nearby. The cogitators began to hum alarmingly, and the shrill, screeching trills of technolingua came from the mechanics fussing around the auspexes. "Most merciful Emperor, what is this?" came from the right. Cornix himself would have happily exclaimed something similar, had he been able to bring himself to utter a word of surprise. On the starboard side, practically touching the cruiser's armored hull, hung an impenetrably black, perfect sphere, crafted from an unknown material. The guest's appearance was not accompanied by any of the usual effects of a ship's translation from the warp to the materium. The object simply appeared there, in a blinding flash of light, and now looked as if it had always been there. "What is this?" the officer gulped, staring in stupor at the colossal object frozen next to the ship. "If only I knew," Arcanum thought, but of course he didn't say it out loud, saving his face. "Scan it," he said instead, slightly hoarsely, peering intently at the object frozen in space. "My Lord Cornix, the object that appeared cannot be scanned," One of the mechanics, standing at the cogitator onto which the Auspex data was displayed, turned in his direction. In terms of, the object is only observable visually. The augurs are receiving a meaningless array of interference. Hypothesis: a malfunction in the scanning array. Hypothesis number 2. The unidentified object is a man-made spacecraft and is actively countering our efforts. Explanation: at the moment of its appearance in the matter, the sphere was moving in a straight line at 48.31% the speed of light. Taking into account the possible error of indirect calculations and the imperfections of optical observation, the speed was extinguished in 0.00001 seconds, which is impossible. Xenos, Cornix exhaled. The probability of such an outcome is 82.99%, the mechanicus confirmed. Note: this Xenos species is unknown to the Imperium. Recommendation: send an astropathic message to the Imperial Navy base in the Gothic sector. Recommendation number 2. Prepare a team for first contact. Recommendation number 3. Prepare an anti-boarding team to repel any potential aggression. Sensible, Arcanum nodded, nodding to his senior aide, who was listening attentively to the tech priest. Send an astropathic message to Portmouth about the appearance of an unidentified ship. Yes, my lord, the officer nodded, contacting the ship's astropath and dictating a message. Keep scanning the sphere. Maybe the Auspex will break through the interference and will learn something. Accepted, the mechanic creaked, returning to his workstation. The rogue trader's fingers ran confidently over the control runes that glowed on the armrests of his throne, sending a signal to the anti-boarding team. Even if it was an unknown ship, the object hadn't yet shown the slightest sign of activity, let alone aggression. The Adeptus Mechanicus representative's recommendations were sound enough to be explicitly enshrined in the Imperial Navy's charter. The Imperium's extensive experience with Xenos threats subtly hinted that there's no such thing as excessive paranoia, and the phrase, "the only good Xenos is a dead Xenos," didn't just pop up out of nowhere. A tense wait ensued. The sphere loomed outside the window, blocking the starlight, while the giving hand studied the unknown object with all available means, receiving only static. Neither the ship's Auspexes, nor the research probes sent by the tech priests, nor even a volunteer with a handheld Auspex deployed on one of the shuttles, were able to report anything new. The sphere could be seen, perhaps even touched, if even a single suicidal person on board had chosen to do so. But no technical means of studying it yielded any results. In fact, if not for the gravitational distortion caused by the presence of such a large object, the Arcanum would have declared it a group hallucination. He even started to open his mouth to voice his witty thought, to at least diffuse the tense atmosphere on the bridge. But the tech priest, who turned away from the cogitator in his direction and squeaked in a puzzled tone in binary, ruined the whole mood. The ship's internal augurs have just detected multiple energy anomalies on decks 8 through 15, he croaked. The nature of the phenomenon is unknown. Addendum. The mechanicus twitched, clearly receiving additional information through the mechadendrites connected to the cogitator. Similar anomalies have been detected throughout the ship. I'm detecting atmospheric fluctuations. Hesitation? The captain frowned. Explanation. A short-term localized increase in the ship's internal atmospheric pressure. Theoretical. The tech priest's vocoder briefly emitted a complex series of grinding sounds, while he swayed in place, clearly processing the massive amount of incoming information. Theoretical. The anomalies are the result of the use of an unknown matter transportation technology. Teleportation, the tech priest said briefly, creaking his technolingua again and turning to the other Adeptus Mechanicus representatives on the bridge. Without using the warp. Tech Priest Majoris notified, he continued. The Skitarii detachment assigned to the ship has been dispatched to protect the Omnissiah's sanctum. Notification. Anti-boarding Team 4 has been dispatched to Deck 13 Bay 2 for visual confirmation of alien presence. Cornix felt his eyelid twitch again. Although, to be fair, such initiative from the Omnissiah's servant was, in fact, entirely understandable. For the last 2 years they had been exploring a planet where the remains of devices presumably manufactured on Holy Terra had been discovered. Long ago, in short. Not even during the dark age of technology. And, as much as the captain wanted to stamp his foot on the floor and tell them all to go away, studying and preserving the finds had been the key condition the Magos had set upon his assumption of the rank of Tech Priest Majoris. And, judging by the obvious agitation, as much as was possible for the Mechanicus, of the Tech Priest on the bridge, warpless teleportation, as he put it, was a compelling enough reason to arbitrarily dispose of part of the crew, without even consulting the captain. Simply notifying him of the dispatch of both the Skitarii, who, technically speaking, were strictly subordinate to the Adeptus Mechanicus, occasionally borrowed from the rogue trader, and one of the crews to repel attacks. Whatever the case, it seemed he had just had a good reason to visit Magos Idicus Dionysius. A very important reason. A tense wait stretched on. Arcanum sat in his seat, periodically glancing at the display of the nearest cogitator, while the bridge hummed like a disturbed beehive. The Mechanicus, still emitting the squeaky, creaking sounds of binary code, circled around his workstation, switching mechadendrites between ports, while the screen before him flashed images from the built-in pict cameras of the Skitarii, who were just approaching the correct part of the ship. The Mechanicus infantry was divided into 4 squads, entering the 13th bay from different corridors, clearly seeking to encircle the unknown intruders. What was that? Cornix leaned forward, noticing a bright white flash on one of the displays, briefly illuminating the image on one side. Skitarius 331.3-Z21 Alpha, the Tech Priest commented, the display shifting and rotating in the direction indicated. Unidentified technological device detected, visually similar to members of the arachnid class. A spider? Aracane blinked in surprise. There are many differences, but the analogy is acceptable. The object, the Mechanicus paused, continuing a moment later, is refusing to scan. The Auspex is returning a pattern of interference similar to the results of a sphere scan. Apparently, it was transported to the corridor via a previously recorded teleportation. Theoretical. The mechanism is currently engaged in studying the life support servitor G11445.1. Additional. The study methods used by the device are unknown. Attempt to capture the object, he finished, his voice half as quiet as before. But the Skitarii, whose eyes were transmitting the transmission, clearly took the command and moved forward. Now Cornix was able to examine the spider in greater detail. From a closer distance, even he could see that the resemblance to ordinary arachnids was purely nominal. The unknown device, while clearly some kind of robot or servitor, had a different number of limbs, and its entire body seemed composed of a multitude of silvery scales. While Arcanum studied the image on the screen, the Skitarii extended one of his hands toward the spider, intending to simply and straightforwardly seize it. Surprisingly, the unknown mechanism ignored the mere appearance of the Skitarii next to it, clearly not intending to be distracted from studying the servitor mounted in the wall, which controlled the life support system in this and a couple of nearby rooms. However, as soon as the Mechanicus soldier extended his manipulator towards the spider, it disappeared in a flash of the already familiar white light, appearing a couple of meters further down the corridor and, as it seemed to Arcanum, turning its front part curiously towards the new actor. Emission of unknown nature detected, the Mechanicus creaked. We assume the mechanism has detected the presence of Skitarii 331.3-Z21-alpha and is conducting some type of scan. Recommendation. What exactly the tech priest wanted to recommend remained unknown. The image on the screen was suddenly completely bathed in a bright white light, flickered, and a ripple of static ran across it. Several frames flickering, and then everything plunged into darkness. The Mechanicus began to fuss, unleashing a long and clearly foul-mouthed tirade in technolingua. Cornix didn't know enough binary to understand anything beyond certain types of common commands. But for some reason, he thought the tech priest was swearing, and a long string of numbers and tables began scrolling across the screen. The image flickered again, and part of the screen showed the camera feed of a nearby Skitarii standing in the same corridor. His mechanical comrade, like the unknown spider, had vanished. What's the matter? Skitarius 331.3-Z21-alpha is not responding to transmitted control commands. Data transmission from the picked camera has been interrupted. The Skitarius's location is unknown. I am scrubbing the most recently received recording frames of any interference. 2 frames are available. Bring it to the screen. The rogue trader rose from his throne, moving closer to the Mechanicus. What the hell is this? In the first image, preserved in the recording, Arcanum saw a spacious and majestic chamber, reminiscent of the palace of some governor on a wealthy planet, the kind whose toilet might even be made of pure gold. At least, there was a fair amount of gold around the Skitarii. It literally covered almost every wall and the massive columns supporting the soaring ceiling. And symbols. A multitude of strange symbols everywhere, the likes of which he had never seen before. But the second thing. In the second frame, plucked by the tech priest from the remnants of the video feed transmitted by the vanished Skitarii, he saw a man. A tall man, dressed in a dark, apparently leather, cloak, looking directly into the Skitarii's camera with an expression of obvious interest and curiosity on his face. But if the spider had transported the Mechanicus warrior to that sphere, and that was the obvious conclusion, how could a man have appeared there? And what if the Skitarii had ended up somewhere else? Or, no, it couldn't. How could there be a person there? It's a person, isn't it? I didn't imagine it. The authenticity of the received images has been confirmed, the Mechanicus replied with a hint of puzzlement. The creature spotted by Skitarii 331.3-Z21-alpha before its cessation of operation is a member of Homo sapiens sapiens with a probability of 84.317%. Obtaining more reliable information from a single frame is not possible. But this is clearly not an Imperial ship. There is no record of such a class of starship, station, or other object in the Adeptus Mechanicus databases, the tech priest confirmed. Theoretical hypothesis number 1. A technical malfunction on Skitarii 331.3-Z21-alpha resulted in a distorted image. Theoretical hypothesis number 2. The creature in the image only appears human. Theoretical hypothesis number 3. The creature in the image is indeed human, possessing a piece of technology of unknown origin. Great, Cornix grumbled. There's insufficient data to make a definitive conclusion. A study of the Attention. The tech priest snapped to attention, cutting himself off mid-sentence. An energy anomaly involving non-warp teleportation has been detected in the tech priest Majoris's quarters. Urgent. Send an anti-boarding team and all Skitarii of the second squad to the compartment. Ensure the safety of Magus Atticus Dionysius. At the senior officer's questioning look, Cornix merely waved his hand and nodded in agreement. In this case, the tech priest's behavior was sheer insolence. going far beyond the agreements reached with the chief mechanicus, but that didn't change the essence of them much. Teleporting aliens into the Magus's private quarters posed a threat to the ship of sufficient magnitude to warrant immediate elimination. After all, Magus Dionysius had direct access to many of the Giving Hand systems, and if aliens were to gain access, everyone on board would be in serious trouble. As captain, Arcanum could certainly revoke that access, possessing supreme authority on the ship, but that only marginally solved the problem. They wouldn't be able to escape the sphere and its inhabitants anyway, since the Magus was, among other things, tasked with persuading the warp drive's machine spirits to agree to carry their ship out of the now less hospitable system. Trying to attack aliens who had clearly demonstrated, if not aggression, then certainly unfriendly intentions for first contact? Not funny. The battlecruiser was a decent combat vessel, and while modifying the Giving Hand for their own purposes, Arcanum, using their connections in the Imperial Navy, made some minor tweaks to the actual weaponry, but that wouldn't have helped them fight a 300-kilometer planetoid. Their vessel simply couldn't physically inflict sufficient damage on the enemy, especially in a situation where they couldn't even scan it to determine even the approximate internal structure and location of vital components. And neither the Skitarii nor the anti-boarding force made it in time. The closest Adeptus Mechanicus soldier was at the door to the Magus's quarters within 5 minutes, but a frowning Cornix who had been monitoring the Skitarii's progress with the tech priest on the bridge via the built-in pict cameras saw him. Without slowing down at the run he'd immediately adopted upon receiving the command, hit the door-opening control, burst into the spacious chambers assigned to Idicus Dionysius, and he froze, seemingly indecisive, staring directly at the tech priest Majoris standing before him. The Magus's quarters were devoid of any aliens, nor any signs of a struggle with them. And Idicus's face, well, the organic part of him that could still display any facial expression, was a mixture of irritation and demanding interest. He clearly hadn't expected such an unceremonious intrusion. A drawn-out beep of binary code emanated from the tech priest on the bridge. And, even without translation, Cornix easily read it as a simple, human, "What the fuck?" "Can we speak through this, Skitarii?" The ability to broadcast the transmission via the built-in Vox repeater is available, the Mechanicus replied after a short pause. Broadcast. Arcanum stepped even closer to the cogitator and, after waiting for a nod from the Omnissiah's servant, continued. Magus Dionysius, I apologize for such an unceremonious intrusion, but are you all right? 4. Captain Cornix? The Magus asked, tilting his head slightly to the side. I, Magos. Your concern was unnecessary. I'm perfectly fine. But you interrupted the sacred litany to the machine god for the proper functioning of the ship you entrusted to me, Captain. The machine spirits in the warp drive are already angry. I ask that you refrain from such behavior in the future. Yes, Magos. My apologies, Arcanum sighed, turning away from the cogitator and Mechanicus and simply spreading his hands at the questioning look of his senior assistant. The tech priest let out another long squeak in technolingua, clearly confirming something with his superior, who responded in kind and then waved a free mechadendrite, clearly commanding the Skitarii to return to their interrupted task of tracking the aliens who had intruded on the ship. The last thing the rogue trader saw on the picked camera feed was Cornix, frozen. Briefly thought he saw some strange interference flickering across the image. But the body of Magos Idicus Dionysius, who had already begun to turn back toward the chambers to resume his interrupted duties, seemed to ripple slightly. as if it were composed of billions of tiny grains of sand, momentarily shifting their position in space, and then freezing back into place, as if nothing had happened. Or had it? No, it's nonsense. Did you see this? He asked those present, just in case. My Lord Cornix. The first mate shook his head in surprise. The figure of the Magus on the screen. It's like a hypothesis, the tech priest croaked. A malfunction in the PICT camera or transmitter of Skitarii 325.9-Z08-Sigma. The unit will be sent for diagnostics after the crisis is over. Current performance is within acceptable limits. You imagined it, Arcanum translated for himself. Perhaps. The events in this warp system could make anything seem like it. And that interference emanating from the sphere outside. Cornix only had time to cringe at the whole situation, when the object outside the bridge's tall, lancet window suddenly shifted, picking up speeds practically impossible for Imperium ships to achieve a standing start. It flew away from the giving hand and disappeared into a strange blue cloud, bright against the void of space that had formed directly in its path. A simultaneously puzzled and tense silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the sounds of cogitators and the rather prolonged squeak of the technolingua emitted by the tech priest. And 10 minutes later, Cornix himself felt the urge to blurt out something rather convoluted in binary, or at least in plain, understandable obscene Gothic. Because all the spiders, transported to the ship by that same warpless teleportation, seemed to vanish into thin air. Not a single anti-boarding party, nor a single Skitarii squad sent to search and capture them, had found anything. And knowing the segmentum they were currently in, they wouldn't be leaving this system for a very long time, even if the machine spirits in the warp drive agreed to activate it in the next 5 minutes. Long enough to comb every nook and cranny of this not-so-small ship and figure out where the aliens had gone. The prospect facing Arcanum made him grind his teeth in impotent rage, recalling all the obscenities and constructs accumulated over his long and eventful life, but the option of approaching any Imperial Navy base or inhabited planet in the segmentum with a potential xenotechnological threat on board appealed to him even less. And he tried not to think about the possible outcome when they found nothing.